Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Today I figured I would talk about antagonists. Last time we had sort of a video on writing. I sort of opened up the comments section and asked people if there was a certain subject matter they'd like me to explore. And one of the things y'all mentioned was you wanted me to talk about antagonists. And because you're some of my listening audience members, I want to honor what you guys are curious about. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in future podcast episodes, let me know in the comments. Hit like and subscribe and join the Gen 1 family, and also consider joining us on Patreon. There's tons of cool perks, including you can sit down with me in your script or your short film, and we can talk about how we can tell your story in the most effective way possible and bring the best out of your work. And there's a lot of other cool perks, like exclusive concept art for a book I'm producing, and lots of full-length uncut content like these podcast episodes. So I cover a lot on YouTube and on Spotify that's available to you for free, but you're really missing out on a lot of deep, in-depth, and practical, tangible advice that you can start implementing into your work immediately. It's not just that sort of philosophical, mumbo jumbo. No, like the whole goal of my Patreon and for Gen 1 is to offer you guys tangible, practical advice in order to herald in the golden age of cinema. So if that's something that interests you, at least give my Patreon page a look, see if it's something that's for you. And we'll work on writing or telling old stories today, is what I like to say, because I think the classic stories is really where we can find the basics, the real basics, the bare bones of what a good story is about. And there isn't quite a story that is great that doesn't have an effective antagonist. And so I kind of wanted to take some time to talk about what an antagonist is. We're going to cover a lot of things, so feel free to jot down notes or pause or whatever you want to do. We're just going to jump right in. So what is an antagonist? In my own words, an antagonist is a character, a force, or a group, or an ideal within the confines of a story that stands against the protagonist. It's always in opposition of the protagonist. He creates conflict, and ultimately, because the antagonistic force exists, it's pushing the story forward. Right? Without the antagonist, I guess it would depend on the kind of story you're telling. There's going to be more on that later, but in most cases, especially with these sort of black and white, cowboy kind of flicks, like Marvel films, the antagonist is sort of what creates the conflict, creates the story, and the superhero has to fight the antagonist. And that is a very black and white, white cowboy hat versus black cowboy hat kind of a story. And while often labeled as the villain, like in these Marvel stories, the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be evil. And we've seen that in superhero films as well, like Killmonger or Thanos. While they are bad guys, we can relate to their motivations, and they make them quite reasonable and human. If you think about it too much, you're like, oh man, I actually kind of agree with Thanos, or I actually kind of agree with Killmonger. Like, just because they're an antagonist doesn't mean they have to be necessarily evil. I think of Watchmen, the Zack Snyder version of Watchmen, where the antagonists are actually the superheroes, which is a really unique twist on the superhero genre. So if you haven't watched Watchmen, that's a great example of the superheroes being the antagonist and the supervillain being the protagonist. So be sure to check that one out. That one's an interesting example there. But like I said, the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be the villain. He doesn't necessarily have to be evil. It's just someone or something whose goals or nature, I guess, is directly in conflict with the protagonist. And some examples of antagonists in film are Darth Vader, classic antagonist. He's an enforcer of the Empire whose very presence is just this menacing, but he's basically the fist of everything that's going against what the Rebel Alliance wants, and ultimately what Luke Skywalker wants, and ultimately his arc reveals a personal connection to the protagonist. So Darth Vader, while he's the bad guy and ultimately he's the fist of the entire Empire, he has a direct connection to the protagonist, which is Luke Skywalker. And then another example would be Sauron from Lord of the Rings. He's sort of the the face of evil, this disembodied force of darkness that affects all things, and to the point that he makes his entire environment all dark and decrepit and slimy and hostile. And so, you almost can't call Sauron a person in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He's sort of like this evil spirit that's sort of housed in this one singular tower, like the Eye of Sauron. So he's an interesting example of an antagonist, because it's not like you could have Aragorn dueling the Eye of Sauron. I don't know if there's any scenario where the Eye of Sauron could actually fight somebody. He's just this evil force that can't be destroyed unless, of course, you cast the ring into the fires of Mordor. So that's an interesting example of an antagonist. He's more of an ideal, this force of nature. And then you have other examples like Killmonger or the Joker, these sort of revolutionary characters, these chaos agents, I guess. And they purely exist to challenge the protagonist's moral code, right? They're sort of clashing with the protagonist's ideological nature. And so these are these sort of different examples of how antagonists can appear in film. And so I've given some examples here, but ultimately, when you're crafting an antagonist, you should be asking yourself, what is a wound or a belief or a desire that motivates the antagonist, right? Because I think what can be really easy for newer writers to do to themselves is they box themselves into this corner where they're thinking only about the protagonist, and they just decide they're going to discover the antagonist along the way. And I think you should take a moment, take a beat, and sit down and ask yourself, in what ways can I create the most conflict out of my protagonist's story? And how can I personify that in the antagonist? And the best way to do that is just to ask yourself, what wound or belief or desire does my antagonist have that's motivating them? Why do they exist? Why does this character have a role in my story? What does my antagonist want? And ultimately, you should ask yourself, why can't the protagonist let the antagonist have what they want, right? So let me think of an example here. If Darth Vader wants Luke to join the dark side, if we're just going to establish that as Darth Vader's desire in the original trilogy, he wants Luke to join the dark side. Okay, why doesn't Luke give Darth Vader what he wants? Why doesn't Luke turn to the dark side and join Vader? Well, Luke doesn't do that for a number of reasons, but let's just say Luke doesn't join the dark side because he has Obi-Wan and Yoda as an influence to him, right? So Luke has Obi-Wan's mentorship in A New Hope as his source of wisdom and guidance. And so what is a way that the antagonist can push against that and be in conflict with Luke's arc? Well, he can kill Obi-Wan, right? And that's exactly what he does in A New Hope. Now, that particular example doesn't go nearly as far because in A New Hope, it's not explicitly established that Darth Vader wants Luke to join the dark side. That desire doesn't really develop until The Empire Strikes Back. But for the sake of my example, I'm just sort of painting an idea that your antagonist should desire something, just like the protagonist desires something. But why doesn't the antagonist get that? And you should take some time to consider, okay, how can I give my antagonist a desire that the protagonist inadvertently or purposefully prevents them from getting that? And that creates conflict, which is ultimately the thing that you want the most out of your story, this conflict. And so, ask yourself, in what ways could the protagonist be tempted to agree with the antagonist, right? Because if we go back to talking about the nutshell technique, which we covered in the last video, ultimately the story is all about whether or not the protagonist runs from their flaw or clings to it, right? So in a way, your antagonist is going to offer an easy way out for the protagonist, right? I mean, if we look at Empire Strikes Back as an example, Luke wants his friends safe, right? He sees that vision of them dying, and Vader offers him a way to keep his friends safe, and it involves Luke joining the dark side, right? That gets Vader what he wants, and that gives Luke what he wants. And so that puts, if Luke agrees to join the dark side, he keeps his friends safe and everybody wins, right? Except within the conflict of the Star Wars story, it's all the theme is about confronting your inner darkness and resisting evil and choosing to do good, and so that puts Luke at odds, in conflict with the philosophical conflict, right? So that's where the balancing act of jumping between the antagonists' want, what the protagonists want, and what the overall theme and the philosophical conflict of the story is. And to sort of simplify all of that, I'll just say this. Give your antagonist a desire. Give your protagonist a desire. And write scenes where the protagonist is invited to get the easy way out. And whatever that easy way out is, it's going to be something that the antagonist wants. It's going to be one and the same thing. And that's what's going to create conflict. And that sort of embodiment of that conflict is the antagonist himself. And we're gonna deep dive into that sort of subject. We're going to talk about sort of the best ways to write an antagonist if your goal is to sound like an amateur. But first, we're going to cut the tape because it's Patreon members from here on out. I want to thank Wesley Hamilton, Rachel DeBicaro, Felix Arroyo, Eden Wilbanks, Kendrew Lee, and Andrew White for being part of the Gen 1 family and supporting me on Patreon. This has been The Golden Hours with Zach Golden, and that's a wrap on YouTube and Spotify. And cut.